Disco Elysium is a game about solving mysteries. Besides the dead body in the tree outside, the biggest mystery is, what is going on inside the main character's head?
There is nothing. Only warm primordial blackness.
Your first interaction is with the ancient reptilian brain, which speaks inside the mind of the detective character you find yourself controlling. The ancient reptilian brain isn't an outside force invading the character's mind, but rather an aspect of himself, a voice in his head, and a source of his most deep-seated thoughts.
The limbed and headed machine of pain and undignified suffering is firing up again.
When the detective wakes, you might expect the voices to stop, given that he is now awake and perhaps a bit more conscious. The ancient reptilian brain does go quiet, but as the detective begins to interact with the world around him, you realize that you are now faced with a cacophony of other voices. Every attribute belonging to your character has its own voice, each representing an aspect of his personality, his ego, and his mind. Among many others, there is logic, drama, empathy, authority, perception, and my personal favorite, Inland Empire, the voice of hunches and gut feelings. These voices speak to you, inserting thoughts into your character's mind and describing their interpretation of the events unfolding before you. At first, some of these voices may seem more reasonable than others. I remember being somewhat taken aback the first time the voice of authority spoke to my character.
A glib remark. Don't let it stand. Assert yourself.
I felt like this wasn't how I wanted my character to act, and that I didn't agree with the voice. The voice of authority continued to speak, however, still occasionally interjecting itself in the protagonist's stream of thoughts.
Retreat is not a winning tactic.
The sense of authority the character's mind expressed likely came from his expectation of what the role of a police officer was, and the culture around policing that expects a police officer to act with such authority. It was easy for me to ignore this voice, and to not identify with what it was saying, and to act in another way. Since I am not a police officer in real life, I am not invested in playing that role, and it does not challenge my sense of identity if someone else does not treat me with that sense of authority. Other voices, like logic, for example, may seem harder to ignore. Many of you will likely believe that if something is logical, then surely it's fact. However, the voice of logic in your head is still just that, a voice in your head, and voices in your head are not absolute truth. Some of the events in the game, and the information you can gather through other voices, are illogical. The Inland Empire skill that relays hunches and gut feelings often contradicts the voice of logic, and yet proves itself to be useful on many occasions. The truth is that all of the skills are just voices in your character's head, interpretations of the world masquerading as reality. By having these thoughts be, in a sense, voiced characters, Disco Elysium highlights that the protagonist's thoughts are separate from the protagonists themselves. If the player internalizes this, just like you can internalize ideas as a gameplay mechanic, the player can also begin to make the same comparisons with their own thoughts and observe the ways in which they may contradict or masquerade as reality. Most are familiar with the concept of intrusive thoughts, that is, thoughts that enter your mind often without prompt, and that are decidedly negative and unpleasant. However, most thoughts are more similar to intrusive thoughts than at first glance, even though they may not feel as intrusive as the explicitly voiced thoughts in Disco Elysium. Under first inspection, many thoughts may seem positive, like, wow, I really love my car. But as soon as your car becomes stolen, lost, damaged, or perhaps you realize it was not truly fulfilling you in the first place, these thoughts can quickly become negative. Thinking is mostly reactionary, and the thoughts involuntary.
A massive pit opens up in your stomach, and the most terrible feeling comes over you.
Yes, your car is in the sea. Face it, so we can start dealing with this.
In other words, you don't choose to be sad that your car was driven through the ice and partially submerged underwater. But that sadness happens all the same. Since you personally identified as the owner of a car, it felt like an actual blow to your identity, your very person, when it was taken from you. We can observe thoughts as they appear in our minds without needing to identify with them. That car did not define you as a person, and there are many ways for you to find enjoyment in your life again without it. If our thoughts do not define us, then who are we? Who is the detective? This question is not just asked by me in this video, but also by the protagonist himself. After suffering an episode of amnesia, the protagonist no longer remembers anything about himself. He begins to piece together parts of his past by interacting with the environment and other people who knew of him.
Hello, officer.
He is told by others and through context that he's a police officer, an alcoholic, and generally a sad, sad man. These are facts about the protagonist's past and personality. However, he does not always believe people when they tell him that he was those things. Not that he thinks they are lying, but rather that the past he cannot remember does not reflect how he currently feels and his current sense of identity. Depending on how the player chooses to make the protagonist act, he may even feel free to ignore the past entirely and act in a completely different manner. The difference in character between the insane, alcoholic protagonist that existed before the game began and the protagonist the player chooses to be after the game begins is in the level of investment in the past. The player has no investment in the protagonist's past, so they are not beholden to it. Your past choices and investments do not need to define how you act in the present. One may feel this point is undercut by the fact that the player is, in a sense, forced to act as a detective in order to complete the game. However, the player can still mindfully pick and choose which aspects of the role of a detective they want to play. They can choose to ignore the voice of authority like I did, and they needn't feel personally attacked like they're a quote-unquote bad detective if they fail at finding a particular clue. So if the protagonist's thoughts can be ignored, and their past is irrelevant to who they are, then who is the protagonist really? He is the being that exists in the present moment, who you as the player chooses for him to be. This makes the player the true consciousness of the protagonist, capable of making decisions without biases created by the character's ego, and free from investments made in the character's past. By positioning the player in the role of the character's consciousness, Disco Elysium may allow the player to come to a realization about their own life, that your thoughts and your past need not dictate how you act in the present moment.
What do you think you're doing right now? Coming to some greater awareness? Look at all these lights, blinking in and out of existence. Thoughts!